Moving on from the neuromuscular junction, we need to look into how an action potential will travel along the muscle membrane. So it's looking at action potential conduction, basically, or action potential propagation is a term that's used also. It's the movement of the action potential. But to do that, we look at what the properties of the membrane are and what an action potential actually is as well. So to start off with, this top piece here is just any membrane. Could be a muscle, could be a neuron, because both can conduct action potentials. You'll notice the inside is showing as negatives. The outside is positives. Remember, at rest, so resting membrane potential, at rest, the inside is negative relative to the outside. In the case of skeletal muscle, it's 70 millivolts lower inside than is outside. So the inside is said to be negative 70 millivolt resting membrane potential. And that potential difference, that is the resting membrane potential I mentioned. Now, is it always dead on exactly 70 millivolts? Nah, it might be negative 69, might be negative 71. There's little variations, but the idea is overall it averages out to about negative 70 millivolts. So when you start looking at the actual makeup, the chemical makeup, sodium and potassium are two of the big ions we have to focus on. Sodium is going to be in a higher concentration outside. You can see how it's a larger, more bold in between the brackets. Brackets means concentration. While inside, it's smaller and not bold. That tells you the higher concentration of sodium is outside the muscle cell. And likewise for potassium. Potassium, here's the bigger print, larger bold, higher concentration inside the cell, potassium, compared to the lower concentration outside. Now these gradients are important because once a channel opens, the ions want to flow from high to low concentration. That means from this resting membrane state, the sodium wants to flow down to its lower concentration. Potassium wants to flow out to its lower concentration. So we're going from high to low concentration. Now, normally though, without a channel being opened, the sarcolemma is pretty much impermeable to these two ions. Now, there are some leak channels and you get a few ions going back and forth, but for the most part, you're really not getting very much movement. You're maintaining these gradients at a resting state. So a graded potentials are local events. They're small, they're not really going to travel very far. Your graded potential is when you have the sarcolemma becomes permeable to sodium a little bit. Now, it might be both sodium and potassium as the case of the neuromuscular junction, but a lot of times it's just sodium channels. So as those sodium ions start to travel in, you notice, you can see right here, sodium is going into the cell. That area, right where it's depolarizing, again, as sodium positive ion goes in, the inside becomes less negative. As you depolarize, it's going to head up to hit threshold. Once you hit threshold, negative 55 millivolts, then shoots all the way up to about positive 30. Basically, the floodgates open and just pours into the cell. When that happens, that depolarization means the polarities changed. The inside has now become positive, with the outside becoming negative. That means that particular point in the membrane has depolarized. It's positive inside. So as that depolarization is occurring, it's only occurring at one spot. But all that positive ion inside can't just stay there. Remember, high concentration to low. There's a lot of sodium ions all located right in here right now because that's where it flooded in. There's not a lot of sodium ions out here up ahead because you haven't opened any channels. You haven't allowed. So you got to keep that in mind. That's high to low concentration. You always want the ions moving high to low. Well, that sodium ion, high concentration, is start moving forward. As it moves forward, all those sodium ions are moving into a lower concentration area. But because you're bringing all these positive ions forward, the inside becomes positive. You depolarize it. And when you depolarize it here, let's say there is a sodium channel there, a voltage regulated sodium channel. More sodium then pours in. All that positive ion charge moves forward again. You have depolarizing these areas. The next channel, more sodium rushes in, more positive ions. And it just keeps repeating over and over. Sodium rushes in, depolarizes that spot, diffuses to where it's already negative. Change the negative positive as you have more voltage regulated channels allowing sodium in. It's moving based on what's called the electrochemical gradient. Electrical, because it's positive going to negative, the opposite attraction. Chemical, high concentration going down to a low concentration. So it's all moving based on those two principles. So every time enough sodium moves forward down the membrane, depolarizing the membrane around it, you can trigger new voltage regulated sodium channels to open. More sodium comes in, keeps on going. Now, this is the action potential moving. This is action potential conduction. Those physical sodium ions constantly moving down the membrane, triggering more and more of these voltage regulated sodium channels to open. So it kind of just washes down like a wave. That's going to be your action potential conduction, the movement or action potential propagation, however you want to call it. But it's the movement of the ions. And those ions moving are what create that charge, that voltage difference, that positive inside versus negative outside. Once you start it, you can't stop it. The only way to stop it is reach the end or physically sever the neuron. But these are traveling fast. We're talking hundreds of miles per hour. The action potentials in certain neurons, in certain nerves in the body, can get upwards of 300 miles per hour. So these things are flying almost instantaneously down these membranes. But that's just the sodium. We have to reset so you can have a future depolarization. So think about a wave in the ocean, or a wave in the lake, or wherever you want to look. You have the front part of the wave. It comes up, it crests, and goes down. There's a thickness here. If the front part of the wave is the movement of sodium ions, they're washing down the membrane. Right behind it is potassium ions. Now you can see here, potassium is leaving the actual cell. Once you reach the top of your depolarization, let's say positive 30, those voltage regulated sodium channels close because sodium's already inside, it's done. Instead, that top part triggers voltage regulated potassium channels to open. And potassium goes out those channels, out of the cell. So by taking all this positive ions, these positive potassium ions, out of the cell, you go from that, let's say positive 30, positive ion leaves, positive 29, positive 28, positive 27, positive 26. You're going through what's called repolarization. You're going from the positive back to the negative. So you're repolarizing the membrane. Basically, you're resetting the membrane. So as those sodium ions wash down, potassium ions are right behind it, following in its wake, resetting the membrane as it goes. So sodium channels close, potassium channels open. So depolarization, up to about positive 30, sodium channels, the voltage regulated sodium channels. Once you hit that positive 30, sodium channels close, voltage regulated potassium channels open, and you repolarize back to the resting membrane state. The whole idea is depolarize and repolarize reset. Because you're going to need to stimulate that neuron again. You're going to need to stimulate that muscle again. This is just resetting it so it can have itself ready for the next stimulation. Repolarization, as I keep mentioning, follows the wave, has to go in the same direction. So repolarization follows behind depolarization. There's a little gap there, a little space, not on top of it, a little space, but it follows resetting the membrane. You've got to reset before you can set again. Now, once you do all this though, that's resetting the electrical because the inside is becoming negative again. But now the problem is though, we still have all potassium outside and sodium inside. You've got to push those back to their original gradients. So you got to get all that potassium back in the cell, all that sodium out of the cell. That's the sodium-potassium pump. It's going to be an active transport mechanism. That means it uses energy, uses ATP, and pushes these ions against their concentration gradient. By pushing them against their concentration gradient, you are resetting the resting membrane potentials. You're resetting the outside being higher concentration of sodium. You're resetting the inside being higher concentration of potassium. So what it looks like it all together, this is what you're seeing. You can see we have our neuromuscular junction will be over here. So let's assume we had a signal come down. That signal came down, transferred across, and started a new action potential. That action potential has to somehow travel down the membrane. We know as long as you hit threshold, that negative 55, as long as you hit that threshold, you're going to trigger a voltage regulated sodium channel to open. If that voltage regulated sodium channel opens, sodium is pouring inside the membrane. The inside becomes positive. It depolarizes. All right, that depolarization is going to wash down the membrane. As those sodium ions travel down their electrochemical gradient, remember electrical, positive attracts to negative, high concentration to low concentration. As you travel down in this fashion, you keep depolarizing future sodium channels. It means more sodium comes in, more positive ions here are cause this membrane to depolarize. It just keeps on going. But in the same time, you then have to make sure that also, as that sodium moves out of there, you close the sodium channels. And when they close, the voltage-regulated potassium channels can open. Those voltage-regulated potassium channels open right at the top of your action potential, at that positive 30 charge. If you notice, in this case, sodium is not moving, potassium is heading out. As potassium leaves, the inside repolarizes, goes back to resting state. And then we have the sodium-potassium pump resetting the ion concentration after this occurs to make sure the sodium and the potassium are back in their resting states. So here is what one single action potential looks like if you were to measure at one point. So this is not propagation, this is not conduction, this is not movement. This is just what at this one point looks like. You'll see at rest, nothing's occurring. Then here is the graded potential. You're trying to build up to the action potential. Once you hit this threshold, negative 55 millivolts, this action potential right here is the depolarization. The sodium ions are flooding through the voltage regulated channels, flooding into the cell. At the peak here, at that one point, voltage regulated sodium channels close, voltage regulated potassium channels open. That means with the open potassium channels, we're now repolarizing. Potassium is going to be flooding out of the cell, and that internal membrane goes back to a negative state. Now, it might overshoot, which they're showing down here, called hyperpolarization. It went a little too far. That's a lot of times because those voltage regulated potassium channels are a little bit slow to close. So you hit -70, all right, close. It's a little bit on the slow side. So you get a little bit too negative. That's where the sodium potassium pump, that's where leakage channels all help to bring it back to homeostasis right at the resting membrane state again. Basically reset things so you can do it all again. That is action potential conduction, also known as action potential propagation. The movement of sodium and potassium ions. So sodium ions down electrochemical gradients, potassium ions helping to reset the electrical charge behind it.